Hello, this is Father Olvera, and I wanted to talk to you about three Masses that we celebrate on Christmas. And the traditions go back to the very early centuries, as early as the 4th century. We celebrate three Masses, usually throughout the world, one at midnight, one at the dawn of Christmas Day, and then we have the Christmas Mass throughout the day. And these origins, as I said, go back to the early 4th century. The first Mass celebrated in Rome was probably by Sixtus III at St. Peter's. Now, some of the early documentation that we have for when these Masses were celebrated are not really too known, but we have some good guesses for how it is that all these traditions came about. So, as the first Mass was celebrated by Pope Sixtus III, probably on Christmas Day on the 25th, churches in the East probably would have been celebrating Christmas about January 6th, which would have been the Feast of the Epiphany. At some point, they would have accepted the tradition of celebrating Christmas on the 25th, but still, to this day, probably stress a little bit more importance of January 6th being the Feast of the Epiphany, the visit of the Magi or the wise men. Now, when we have the very first Mass being celebrated in Jerusalem, probably comes out of a tradition that started with the celebration of the office. In other words, they would have these readings, these celebrations before it was a Mass, starting at midnight in Bethlehem. And these pious Jerusalem people Christians living in Jerusalem, would make a pilgrimage all the way from Bethlehem to the Church of the Resurrection in Jerusalem. Now, resurrection in Greek means anastasis. So that is actually in commemoration of Saint Anastasia, who we actually celebrate in the Roman martyrology, even though she wasn't a Roman martyr. She was still martyred, just not in Rome. So actually, the celebration had nothing to do, the second Mass at dawn had nothing to do really with the birth of Christ. It was just a commemoration of her day, since she was actually martyred, as tradition says, on Christmas Day. And the Pope probably took notice of this in a little bit later, because in about the early 400s, he actually decided to build a church in honor of Mary, the Mother of the Divine, the Mother of the Divinity. And this church was known as St. Mary Major. And within this church, he built this little chapel, this little place that would commemorate the birth of Christ, similar to what it is they had in Rome. And as time went on, he took some of these traditions, probably or possibly from the East, and started to incorporate them in the churches in Rome. So at midnight, instead of celebrating maybe the office or the readings, they would actually turn it into a Mass, and then he would have a commemoration also of Saint Anastasia at dawn, so that would have turned into a Mass also. And then there would have been this Christmas celebration of just more of the readings, more of just a liturgy, back at St. Peter's Basilica later on. So he would travel from a church, the St. Peter's Basilica, to St. Anastasia to celebrate Mass, the church in Rome named St. Anastasia. And then he would probably head back to the church in Rome, St. Peter's, to celebrate some more Christmas prayers, more the Christmas office. And so that Christmas office probably turned into a third Mass, which would have been a Christmas Day Mass. So we had the very first Mass at midnight that seemed to have formed out of some readings and some liturgy celebrations. And then we had the second Mass that probably would have turned out to be this Mass of Anastasia in the early morning to turn into a second Christmas Mass. And then the third Christmas Mass would have been celebrated as more of this liturgy for Christmas Day that actually turned into a Mass instead of just some of these readings. So some of these early traditions that we celebrate to this day, we are still celebrating. And the Vatican has actually given priests permission to celebrate Masses 3 times on Christmas Day. One at midnight, one at dawn, and one throughout the day. And of course there are some liturgical exceptions for for as many people that you might have as a church, so more Masses might be needed. So priests may actually need to celebrate more than 3 Masses in a day. But anyway, these nice early traditions that we have are Christmas traditions that we keep, are Christmas traditions that will continue. And here we want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and hope to see you at one of these Masses or to join us through the live stream. So thank you for your time. Merry Christmas to all of you, and God bless.